Hello and welcome to Amit's Tech Sessions. My name is Amit and I'm a software architect. In this session, which is tech session number 18, I will talk about zero trust architecture, why it is important to build a zero trust architecture on AWS, how you can implement a zero trust architecture on AWS, and I will also cover some of the best practices which you should leverage to implement a zero trust architecture on AWS. So let's start. First, let's understand what is zero trust model. Zero Trust is a modern security model which is founded on the design principle of never trust, always verify. What does it mean? It means that Zero Trust always requires all the devices, applications, and users to be authenticated, authorized, and also regularly validated before being granted access to a specific network. It does not matter whether those devices, applications, or users are inside the network or outside the network. Zero Trust always assumes that threats can originate from both outside and inside the network, which requires continuous verification of the users, devices, or any other type of access requests. So, in a nutshell, Zero Trust says that please don't trust anyone, always verify. That is what is Zero Trust model in security. So, let's understand why Zero Trust is essential on AWS. Cloud environments today have become more complex. For example, if you look at AWS, AWS has a distributed and scalable infrastructure. And for that reason, it requires strong security controls. And Zero Trust architecture can help with those strong security controls. In the traditional networks, we used to have perimeter-based security model, and they now have become insufficient. So an example is to control access to an on-premises network using firewalls, etc. But for cloud, only firewalls do not work as a complete security model. Cloud environments, especially AWS, has a multi-region, multi-account setup, which increases the attack surface for the attackers. And that is the reason it is critical to implement Zero Trust on AWS. Also, these days, threat landscape is always evolving and threats can occur from insider within your organization and outsider which are external to your organization. So if you implement Zero Trust on AWS, it provides a robust protection from insider as well as the outsider threats. So let's understand some of the key benefits of Zero Trust implementation on AWS. And these three on the slides are the primary benefits, which I would call them out. So the first one is enhanced security posture. One of the Zero Trust principle is continuous verification. Zero Trust model enforces the verification for each request. So each request is authenticated and authorized, which provides you the enhanced security. In AWS, you can use AWS IAM, which is used to ensure that every user, service, and device is verified before accessing resources, and which ultimately reduces the risk of unauthorized access. The second benefit is reduced attack surface. One of the other principle of Zero Trust is micro-segmentation of networks. So in AWS, Zero Trust isolates the resources using AWS VPC and also the security groups, which prevents attackers from easily moving laterally across the environment. So attack surface is reduced by implementing Zero Trust. And the third one is improved compliance and governance. Zero Trust on AWS, it enforces strict access control, encryption, and monitoring practices, which helps meet organizations their regulatory and compliance requirements, for example, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, etc. And there are services like AWS Config and Security Hub, which offer centralized management of security configurations and compliance reporting, which makes governance easier. Now let's understand some of the core components of Zero Trust on AWS. The first core component is identity and access management. It is very central to the Zero Trust. AWS IAM is a service which provides authentication and authorization capabilities, and it helps enable fine-grained access control. Second component is least privileged access. This component says that limit the permissions to only what is necessary using the IAM roles or policies, etc. For example, in S3 buckets in AWS, you can implement S3 bucket policies. In VPC, use security groups, also use network ACLs to enforce the minimal access. And that is what this component talks about. The third component is micro-segmentation. In AWS VPCs allow the segmentation of resources and services, and AWS VPC helps you to have an isolated private network for your workloads in AWS. The fourth component is encryption. Encrypt the data addressed using AWS KMS keys and also in transit using TLS is one of the core component of Zero Trust on AWS. The fifth one is continuous monitoring. So in AWS, you can use AWS CloudTrail, AWS Config, and Amazon GuardDuty for continuous logging, auditing, and monitoring capabilities. You can also use AWS CloudWatch for logging and monitoring. And sixth core component is network security. So in AWS, we have services like AWS Web Application Firewall, AWS Shield, VPC flow logs, etc. to secure the network boundaries and also to help protect against the DDoS attacks. So now let's understand how you can implement Zero Trust architecture on AWS. There are various areas which you need to look after. The first one is identity verification. So within identity verification, you implement MFA, multi-factor authentication with AWS IAM, and AWS SSO can also be used. You can centralize your identity management with AWS Identity Center, and you can also integrate with external identity providers such as Okta or Active Directory by leveraging AWS Cognito. The second area of implementing Zero Trust is access controls. So you can enforce least privilege by using IAM roles with well-scoped permissions. You can also leverage attribute-based access control to restrict access based on the user attributes. The third area is to secure access to the resources. In AWS, you can isolate workloads using Amazon VPCs and AWS subnets. You can also secure your API access using AWS API Gateway, and you can enforce authentication via the Amazon Cognito, etc. The fourth area of implementing Zero Trust is data protection. You can encrypt the sensitive data with using AWS KMS or Key Management Service, and especially for improved security, you can use customer managed keys from AWS KMS. You can enable S3 encryption by default, EBS encryption by default, etc. So those are the steps you can take for data protection. And the last but not the least area to implement Zero Trust is continuous monitoring and response. There are services like AWS CloudWatch, AWS Config, Amazon GuardDuty. They can help monitor the unusual activity within your AWS environment or your AWS workloads. You can also leverage AWS Security Hub to centralize the security findings across your AWS environment. Let's look at this simple example of a web application architecture on AWS. So we have users who hit the domain name of that application, and then DNS is served by the service Amazon Route 53. Web application content is cached at the edge location, and CloudFront is used for that. Web application is fronted by an application load balancer, and then web tier is hosted on a bunch of EC2 instances as part of an auto-scaling group. And load balancer gets the content from the web tier, then web tier communicates with an application tier, which is also hosted on a bunch of EC2 instances as part of an auto-scaling group. So in this, you can also have a database tier, which I have not demonstrated for simplicity. Now let's understand how you can implement Zero Trust within the same web application architecture by using the AWS services. So the first up is AWS WAF or Web Application Firewall, which provides layer 7 security at the edge. That means it can provide the security at the Amazon CloudFront level. Then there is AWS Shield, which provides protection to the network and infrastructure from DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks. And then there is second WAF or Web Application Firewall, which provides layer 7 security for anyone who has, let's say, bypassed the Amazon CloudFront or have got access by randomly searching the IPs. So second WAF provides the protection at the load balancer level. And then there are other services such as AWS KMS, which provides encryption at rest for the resources in AWS Cloud. Then there is AWS IAM, or Identity and Access Management Service, which provides authentication and authorization capabilities. And then there is CloudWatch, which provides logging and continuous monitoring capabilities. And there are some other services which you can leverage, such as Security Hub, AWS Config, Amazon Guard Duty, etc., as we have previously covered them. So now I will talk about some of the best practices which should be used while implementing Zero Trust architecture on AWS. The first one is enabling the multi-factor authentication everywhere. So when you deploy or host your workloads on AWS, you should require MFA for all privileged users and resources, including IAM and root accounts. The second best practice is to adopt the principle of least privilege. You should regularly audit and refine IAM policies to ensure that minimal permissions are attached to IAM roles and policies. The third best practice is to monitor and analyze the network traffic. You can enable VPC flow logs and you can analyze the traffic using Amazon Guard Duty to detect the threats. The fourth best practice is to enforce the strict identity policies. For this, you can use AWS Identity Center to centralize the identity governance, and you can also enforce the consistent access policies by using AWS Identity Center. The fifth, but not the least, best practice is to implement the strong encryption. And to do that, you can use services like AWS KMS, which helps you encrypt all the sensitive data in transit at rest. And you can especially use customer managed key from AWS KMS to have the improved security. So in conclusion, Zero Trust on AWS emphasizes strict identity verification, least privilege access, micro-segmentation, and continuous monitoring to secure the workloads. Implementing Zero Trust reduces the risk of both insider and outsider threats, aligning with the dynamic nature of the cloud environments. AWS offers a rich set of tools and services that facilitate Zero Trust, which enables the organizations to secure their assets without compromising on agility or scalability. That's all I have for this video. I hope this was useful. If you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn or Medium, there are QR codes up on the screen. Thank you very much.